I really miss you. We don't spend time together enough.
Honey, I'm sorry, I'm just too busy these days. But trust me, everything will be fine.
Loneliness does not arrive suddenly. It enters quietly, without warning, and settles into places no one notices at first. It does not come from being alone, but from being ignored by someone who promised to always be there. This is not a story of passion or desire. This is a story of absence. The kind of absence that grows even when two people sleep in the same bed. The kind of absence that turns conversations into routines and love into responsibility. Aisha was married, she was safe, respected, and financially secure. From the outside, her life looked complete. People admired her stability and called her fortunate. But inside her heart, something was slowly fading. She did not want luxury. She did not want gifts or grand gestures. She wanted time. She wanted presence. She wanted to feel chosen again. This story is about how emotional neglect can quietly open doors that should never be opened. It is about how unmet needs can blur boundaries without intention, and how one moment of attention can feel like oxygen to a heart that has been suffocating for years. This is Aisha's story, and it could belong to many others. Aisha and Rohan did not marry out of pressure or compromise. Their marriage began with laughter, late-night conversations, and shared dreams. They met when life felt simple and hopeful. Back then, Rohan made time for everything, for her voice, for her thoughts, for her presence. They spoke about the future with excitement. They imagined a life where they would grow together, where success would never come at the cost of connection. Rohan promised he would always be there, and Aisha believed him. In the early years, marriage felt warm. They cooked together. They argued playfully. They fell asleep talking about their days. Even silence felt comfortable back then. But slowly, things began to change. Not because of a fight, not because of betrayal, but because of ambition. Rohan's career began to grow. With growth came responsibility. With responsibility came pressure. And with pressure came absence. At first, Aisha understood. She supported him. She encouraged him. She told herself this phase was temporary. After all, he was building a future for them. But temporary slowly became permanent. Late nights became routine. Phone calls replaced conversations. Emails replaced eye contact. Dinner was no longer a shared moment. It became a silent routine. Rohan ate while checking his phone. Aisha watched television alone. When she spoke, he listened halfway. When she laughed, he barely noticed. When she stayed quiet, he didn't ask why. Birthdays were celebrated with quick apologies. Anniversaries were remembered at the last moment. Weekends were promised and postponed. Aisha stopped expecting surprises. Then she stopped expecting time. Eventually, she stopped expecting anything at all. She told herself that this was what adulthood looked like, that love matured into responsibility, that romance faded naturally. But deep inside, she felt something else. She felt invisible. She began to miss being seen, not as a wife managing a home, not as a supportive partner, but as a woman with thoughts, emotions, and needs. Rohan never raised his voice at her. He never disrespected her. And that made her confusion even harder to explain. How do you complain about someone who is technically doing everything right? How do you explain loneliness when there is no obvious wrongdoing? So Aisha stayed quiet. She smiled in public. She answered, "I'm fine," automatically. But at night, when Rohan slept beside her, she stared at the ceiling. She wondered when they stopped talking, when they stopped touching emotionally, when they stopped choosing each other. The marriage did not break. It simply stopped breathing. And Aisha felt herself slowly fading within it. Aisha did not plan to return so soon, yet the sense of calm from her first session lingered longer than she expected. She told herself she was going back for her health, for the tension in her shoulders, and the fatigue that refused to leave. But somewhere beneath that reasoning, she knew it was also for the quiet comfort she had felt in that room. When she returned the following week, the space felt familiar, almost welcoming in a way she had not felt anywhere else recently. Arjun greeted her with the same professional warmth, neither distant nor overly familiar, just present. He remembered small details she had mentioned before. which surprised her more than it should have. It made her realize how rarely people remembered what she said. As the sessions continued over the following weeks, a gentle routine formed between them. There were no rushed movements and no awkward silences, only a steady calm that allowed her to relax. Arjun spoke only when necessary, yet when he did, his words were thoughtful and measured. He asked about her comfort, her stress, and her general well-being in a way that felt genuine rather than routine. Aisha found herself opening up in small, careful ways, sharing pieces of her day and fragments of her thoughts. She never spoke badly about her husband, but the absence in her marriage became evident in what she did not say. Arjun listened without trying to fix anything, which made her feel safe. She realized that being heard did not require solutions, only attention. With each session, she felt less like a problem that needed managing and more like a person who mattered. Her laughter returned in small moments, surprising her each time it escaped naturally. She began to notice how light she felt afterward, as though she had set something down. At home, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Conversations with Rohan felt rushed and distracted, often interrupted by phone calls or fatigue. She tried to share small things about her day, but they rarely held his focus for long. Eventually, she stopped trying to speak. The silence at home felt heavier now that she knew what presence felt like. Isha began looking forward to her sessions more than she wanted to admit. Not because of anything improper, but because of how understood she felt. That realization brought discomfort and guilt. She questioned herself repeatedly, reminding herself of her boundaries and responsibilities. Nothing inappropriate was happening, yet something emotional was unfolding. Arjun too was aware of the shift, though he never allowed it to show. He maintained professionalism, careful not to cross any lines, but he could sense her vulnerability and carried the weight of it quietly. There were moments when their conversations paused, filled with thoughts neither voiced, moments where emotions lingered just beneath the surface. Aisha often left wondering why something so simple felt so meaningful. She did not seek affection, yet she felt connected, and that frightened her more than she expected, because she knew emotional closeness could be just as powerful as physical proximity, and she was standing dangerously close to something she did not fully understand. After the confrontation, Aisha and Rohan agreed to begin counseling, understanding that acknowledgement alone could not repair years of neglect, and that rebuilding trust required structured effort, patience, and honesty. The counselor encouraged them to speak openly about their feelings, their unmet needs, and the silent resentments that had grown unnoticed over time, providing a safe space to voice what had been unspoken for years. Aisha shared the depth of her loneliness, the quiet longing for attention, and the subtle ways that neglect had wounded her heart, while Rohan listened with a mixture of guilt, regret, and growing awareness of the damage his absence had caused. They both realized that love is not measured solely in financial provision, gestures, or intentions, but in consistent attention, emotional presence, and the willingness to prioritize each other, even amidst life's demands. Arjun's role in Aisha's life remained in her reflections, not as a betrayal but as a lesson, highlighting the importance of being seen, heard, and valued, and reminding her that seeking comfort elsewhere is often the result of unmet needs, not wrongdoing. Rohan acknowledged the emotional neglect he had unknowingly imposed, promising to actively engage in their relationship, to listen without distraction, and to choose her presence over work whenever possible. Slowly, the marriage began to breathe again, with small gestures of connection, shared laughter, and meaningful conversations that reminded them both why they had chosen each other in the first place. Aisha learned that courage and honesty could open doors to healing, while Rohan discovered that love requires active participation, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront one's own shortcomings. Together, they realized that the consequences of neglect are not just emotional, but physical and mental as well, and that attention, when given consistently, has the power to restore what time and absence had eroded. By the end of the counseling sessions, there was no instant perfection, but a shared understanding that rebuilding a marriage is a process, a deliberate choice, and a daily act of showing up for one another. Loneliness does not stay only in the heart for long, because eventually it finds a way to settle into the body as well. Aisha began waking up tired even after a full night's sleep, feeling a heaviness she could not explain in simple words. Her shoulders were always tense, her neck ached constantly, and her thoughts felt crowded even in moments of silence. She tried ignoring it at first, convincing herself that stress was a normal part of adult life and marriage. But the exhaustion grew deeper, following her through the day and waiting for her again at night. Small things started overwhelming her, and emotions she once managed easily now felt too heavy to carry alone. Rohan noticed she seemed quieter, but he assumed rest would fix everything once his schedule eased. Aisha did not correct him, because she had grown used to her feelings being postponed. After several restless nights and growing discomfort, she finally decided to visit a doctor. The doctor listened carefully as Aisha described her symptoms, nodding with understanding rather than concern. She was told her body was reacting to prolonged stress, emotional fatigue, and lack of rest. The advice was simple but surprising, suggesting therapy, relaxation, and regular physical care. Among the recommendations was massage therapy, not as luxury, but as a form of healing. Aisha hesitated at first, unsure why such a suggestion made her uncomfortable. Perhaps it was because it felt like admitting that something was truly wrong. After days of hesitation, she finally booked a session at a well-reviewed wellness center near her home. The decision felt small, yet strangely significant, as though she was stepping into unfamiliar territory. On the day of her appointment, she arrived early and sat quietly in the waiting area. The room was calm, filled with soft lighting and gentle sounds meant to slow the mind. For the first time in a long while, no one expected anything from her. She was not a wife managing a home or a partner waiting patiently. She was simply a person allowed to pause. When Arjun entered the room, his demeanor was professional and composed, immediately putting her at ease. He explained the process clearly and respectfully, ensuring she felt comfortable before beginning. There was no rush in his movements or tone, only quiet attentiveness. As the session progressed, Aisha felt her body slowly respond, releasing tension it had held for months. Her breathing deepened naturally, as though her body recognized safety before her mind did. Arjun noticed areas of strain and adjusted carefully, maintaining professionalism at every moment. Occasionally, he asked simple questions about comfort and pressure, never assuming, always asking. Those small considerations affected her more deeply than she expected. She realized how long it had been since someone paid attention to her needs without distraction. When he gently asked how she was feeling, the question landed heavier than intended. She answered honestly, though briefly, unsure why her voice felt tight. Arjun listened without interruption, without advice, and without judgment. That silence felt different from the silence at home. It felt present rather than empty. When the session ended, Aisha felt lighter, not just physically, but emotionally as well. She thanked him politely and prepared to leave, expecting the moment to pass like any other appointment. But as she stepped outside, she realized something had shifted inside her. For the first time in a long while, she felt noticed, and that feeling followed her home. Aisha began to notice a pattern in her feelings, a quiet tug toward the calm she experienced during her sessions with Arjun, one that seemed to grow stronger with each visit and contrasted sharply with the distant routine at home that left her feeling invisible. She tried repeatedly to reconnect with Rohan, suggesting small outings, dinners, or even simple conversations in the hope of reviving the warmth and closeness they had once shared, but each attempt ended in delay, distraction, or polite excuses that left her heart sinking a little more each time. Even when they sat across from each other at the dinner table, she could feel the invisible barrier that had grown between them, a wall built of work stress and years of unspoken needs that neither of them had addressed. The quiet comfort she felt with Arjun became a mirror, reflecting the absence she had learned to accept at home, showing her in painful detail what she had been missing for months and years, and making the emptiness in her own life feel heavier than ever. Arjun offered a simple presence that she had longed for silently, listening without judgment, responding with gentle attention, and asking questions that mattered, no matter how small, which made her feel valued in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Each session brought laughter and small moments of relief. And yet, the realization that she was seeking emotional fulfillment outside her marriage filled her with guilt, fear, and confusion, creating a tension inside her heart that she could not easily name or escape. Arjun was aware of the delicate line they were walking, struggling internally with his professional responsibility, while noticing the bond of trust and comfort growing between them, knowing that every word and every pause carried weight beyond mere relaxation. The emotional closeness between them was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but for Aisha, it became intoxicating because it reminded her of what she had lost: attention, care, and the sense of being truly seen. She began comparing the quiet attentiveness of Arjun to the distracted presence of Rohan, and the contrast stung with every conversation, every laugh, and every moment of ease she experienced during her sessions. At home, she felt the absence even more acutely, noticing how little energy, time, or focus Rohan devoted to her, and how silence and routine had replaced the connection they once cherished. Aisha's mind wrestled constantly with conflicting emotions, oscillating between gratitude for the comfort she received and guilt for the emotional refuge that she could not help but rely on, questioning whether seeking understanding elsewhere was a betrayal or simply a human need unmet. Each session became a delicate balancing act where she had to navigate the relief of being heard while restraining the desire to depend too much on someone who was not part of her marriage, a struggle that weighed on her more heavily with every visit. The more she felt understood by Arjun, the more she recognized the depth of neglect she had endured at home, and the more unbearable it became to live in silence beside Rohan, whose attention she could no longer take for granted. Arjun's quiet presence became both a comfort and a warning, a safe space where she could breathe, but also a reminder of the dangerous ease with which emotional reliance could grow without physical interaction. She realized that comfort, when paired with absence, could feel intoxicating, pulling her towards someone who offered what her marriage had long stopped providing, and the recognition of that truth terrified her. Aisha began to leave each session with her emotions tangled, simultaneously lighter and heavier, aware of the fragile balance between gratitude, longing, and guilt, and wondering how long she could walk that line without consequences. The dangerous comfort of being truly heard and understood became a paradox, offering relief while amplifying the pain of unmet needs at home, forcing her to confront feelings she had tried for so long to ignore. By the end of each visit, she felt both relief and fear, joy and remorse, and a quiet awareness that something in her life was shifting in ways she could not control, leaving her heart caught between the past she longed for and the present she could not escape. The breaking point did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, like a shadow stretching across Aisha's heart, until one day she realized that her patience had run out, and the silence she had tolerated for so long had become unbearable. It was a weekend Rohan had promised he would spend entirely with her, a rare opportunity she had anticipated with hope and careful planning. Yet he returned home late, exhausted, distracted, and unaware that his absence was echoing louder than ever. Aisha waited in the living room, dinner untouched on the table, feeling a heaviness she could no longer ignore, each passing minute reinforcing the loneliness she had carried silently for years. When Rohan finally entered, he spoke in hurried tones, mentioning work, meetings, and deadlines, leaving no space for the conversation she had been craving. And in that moment, Aisha felt the weight of all the neglected months collapse onto her heart. She tried to speak gently at first, sharing how the delays and absences made her feel invisible, how she missed the warmth and attention they had once shared. But her words seemed to vanish in the rush of his explanations and the constant hum of responsibilities. Frustration, sadness, and exhaustion mingled inside her until they erupted in a quiet, trembling voice, one that was firm yet vulnerable, demanding acknowledgement of the loneliness she could no longer hide. Rohan, startled by her intensity, finally paused and looked at her properly, but the shock of her emotional honesty clashed with his habitual focus on work, leaving both of them in an uncomfortable silence that felt heavier than words. For the first time, Aisha realized that no postponement, no excuse, and no simple reassurance could fill the void that years of neglect had created, and that understanding alone would not undo the emotional distance between them. The realization shook her, but it also clarified her next steps. She could no longer rely on quiet hope or delayed attention to sustain her heart, and she needed to reclaim her emotional well-being on her own terms. That night, she made a decision she had been contemplating for weeks, but had postponed out of guilt and fear. She would cancel her upcoming sessions with Arjun, not because she wanted to sever the only connection that made her feel alive, but because she recognized that change needed to begin at home. It was a painful choice, one that left her heart heavy and conflicted, but it was also an act of courage, a declaration that she would confront her reality rather than continue seeking comfort elsewhere. The following day, she sat down with Rohan, steadying herself, despite the tremor in her chest, and spoke with honesty and clarity, sharing every feeling she had stored, every lonely night, and every moment when she had felt unseen and unimportant. Rohan listened, initially in disbelief, then with growing awareness, as if each word peeled away the layers of distraction he had wrapped around himself for years, leaving him exposed to the reality he had ignored. There were tears, apologies, and moments of uncomfortable silence, but within that vulnerability came the first seeds of reconnection, a recognition that they had both contributed to the widening distance, and that repair required more than promises. It required presence. Aisha felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that confrontation was only the beginning, and that the path ahead would require sustained effort, patience, and mutual choice. She realized that emotional honesty was both terrifying and liberating, and that admitting the pain of neglect was the first step toward healing a marriage that had stopped breathing slowly over time. Rohan, for his part, began to understand that love is not only measured in provision or success, but in attention, presence, and the willingness to choose one another consistently, even amidst the demands of life. By the end of the conversation, there was no miraculous solution, no instant restoration, but a quiet promise to try, a tentative agreement to prioritize connection, and a shared acknowledgement of the fragility of what they had almost lost. That night, Aisha went to bed, feeling the weight of the past, the uncertainty of the future, and a strange, cautious hope that the breaking point had been necessary to awaken them both to what truly mattered. And somewhere deep inside, she recognized that true change would not come from another person, but from courage, communication, and the deliberate choice to rebuild what had been quietly eroding for years. With the lessons of the past lingering in their hearts, Aisha and Rohan began to create new routines, small rituals of connection that reminded them daily of the importance of presence and emotional awareness. The scars of misunderstandings and unspoken frustrations were still faintly visible, but instead of letting them fester, they treated them as gentle reminders of the work yet to be done. They started planning weekend walks, meandering through parks or along quiet streets, letting the rhythm of their footsteps mirror the slow, steady rebuilding of trust. Shared meals became more than sustenance. They were sacred pauses where screens stayed off, and the aroma of food mingled with laughter and conversation. On quiet evenings, they allowed dialogue to flow freely, unhurried by the demands of the outside world, rediscovering the comfort of simply being in each other's presence. Aisha found herself smiling more genuinely, recognizing that the effort to rebuild trust was slowly restoring the warmth she had longed for. She noticed the subtle ways Rohan listened, how he remembered the little anecdotes she shared about her day, how he paused before answering to consider her feelings, and with each thoughtful gesture, her heart opened a little more. The guarded walls she had built were softening, brick by careful brick. Rohan, in turn, became mindful of the impact of his absence. He began to check in with intention, not obligation, asking about Aisha's day with curiosity rather than routine. He celebrated small victories, her promotion at work, the success of a meal she had cooked, the quiet satisfaction of a shared joke, moments that he once would have overlooked in the rush of life. He discovered that presence was not a grand act, but a series of small, consistent choices that spoke louder than words. Each day became a deliberate commitment to prioritize the marriage over distractions, and each small success reinforced the possibility of lasting change. They learned to apologize without defensiveness, to express needs without fear, and to listen actively, transforming their interactions into opportunities for understanding rather than mere routine. Even disagreements became opportunities to practice patience, empathy, and clarity, replacing blame with curiosity. Evenings that were once silent or filled with tension became spaces of reflection, laughter, and gratitude. Sometimes they would sit in companionable silence, hands brushing over the table, feeling a connection that words could not capture. Slowly, the distance that had grown over years began to shrink, replaced by a quiet intimacy that felt both new and familiar. Aisha realized that new beginnings are not sudden, but cultivated through patience, courage, and mutual commitment. Healing required consistent effort from both hearts, small daily choices that reinforced care and presence. And in these moments, both ordinary and extraordinary, she and Rohan discovered that love, when tended with intention, could bloom again in ways more resilient and profound than before. Aisha spent quiet moments reflecting on their journey, often sitting by the window as the late afternoon light spilled across the room, warm and gentle. She acknowledged how emotional neglect, subtle and slow, could silently erode love and trust over time, leaving cracks that were easily overlooked in the rush of daily life. She understood now that seeking comfort elsewhere, though human and understandable, was never the true solution. It was a symptom of unmet needs, a signal that hearts long for acknowledgement and presence. She realized that boundaries, communication, and emotional presence were not optional. They were the very foundation sustaining any relationship. Loneliness, when left unattended, could seep into the corners of a marriage, manifesting in ways that were invisible yet corrosive, creating emotional voids that neither partner intended but both felt. Rohan spent his own time in introspection, confronting the uncomfortable truth that good intentions alone were insufficient. A kind word or thoughtful gesture could never compensate for absent attention, for the failure to listen deeply, or for disengagement at critical moments. He recognized that active participation, empathy, and consistent effort were not just actions but commitments that gave life to love. Together, they acknowledged the role of Arjun, not as a threat to their bond, but as a mirror reflecting what had been missing. His presence had highlighted the essential truth. Human hearts crave acknowledgement, listening, and understanding. Rather than resentment, they felt gratitude for the clarity this reflection brought, illuminating the spaces they needed to nurture within their own relationship. Sitting together in candid conversation, Aisha and Rohan explored what they had learned. Vulnerability and honesty, they realized, were not weaknesses but tools, deliberate acts that could transform connection. They acknowledged that neglect, even when unintentional, was never harmless, and that intention without presence could quietly harm the bonds they cherished most. They began documenting small victories, moments when one noticed the other's efforts, shared experiences that fostered closeness, and acts of attentiveness that reminded them daily of their commitment. This record became a living testament to progress, a shield against the old patterns that had once quietly undermined them. Through reflection, they confronted lingering guilt, fear, and unspoken resentment, transforming these heavy emotions into insight, understanding, and motivation for meaningful change. Every recollection of past missteps became a lesson rather than a burden, a roadmap to navigate the emotional terrain of their marriage with greater care. By observing their past with honesty, they made a shared pledge to build a future grounded in awareness, empathy, and deliberate effort, cultivating the emotional fabric of their marriage as attentively as a gardener tends to a cherished garden. And in this deliberate cultivation, they discovered that love was not just a feeling, but a practice, one that required presence, patience, and an unwavering commitment to each other's hearts. As weeks passed, Aisha and Rohan discovered that rebuilding trust was not forged in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the quiet, consistent acts of attentiveness that quietly whispered care, respect, and presence to one another. Each day became an opportunity to demonstrate that love is an active, living choice rather than a passive state. They began celebrating small victories, those often overlooked moments that carried immense weight. A conversation carried without interruption, a shared laugh over a private joke, an evening walk where no screens or errands intruded, and a meal savored together, the focus entirely on each other rather than the outside world. These fragments of time, seemingly ordinary, became sacred rituals that rebuilt the scaffolding of their emotional intimacy. Each small victory strengthened the bridge between them. Aisha noticed her laughter returning more naturally, unforced and spontaneous, a sound that had been quieted by years of unnoticed needs. Her anxieties about being unseen, unheard, or unimportant began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet confidence that her presence mattered and that her feelings were genuinely acknowledged. Her heart, once weighted with the ache of neglect, now felt lighter, buoyed by the steady rhythm of shared attention. Rohan observed the subtle transformations within himself as well. He found fulfillment not in gestures of obligation, but in truly participating, mindfully and attentively, in the life he shared with his wife. He discovered the quiet joy that came from noticing the small details, the way Aisha's eyes lit up when she spoke of a new idea, the comfort of her hand in his during a moment of vulnerability, the warmth that grew from simply being fully present. Together, they recognized that strengthening the bond between them required both patience and vigilance. They understood that old patterns, like weeds in a garden, could return if left unattended, and that proactive engagement, intentional listening, daily acts of care, shared reflection was the key to preventing emotional distance from creeping back. They began discussing the future openly, without reservation. Dreams, expectations, and commitments were laid on the table in honest conversation, ensuring that their renewed connection would not be taken for granted or assumed, but intentionally nurtured. These discussions became a compass, guiding them toward a shared vision while honoring each individual's needs and desires. By nurturing the emotional foundation of their relationship, they discovered a sense of security, trust, and partnership that they had once overlooked. The bond they now shared felt both resilient and tender, a living testament to the power of attention, presence, and conscious effort. What had once been taken for granted was now cherished deeply, not because it was effortless, but because it was built deliberately, day by day, moment by moment, with love as both the labor and the reward. In the quiet aftermath of confrontation, reflection, and effort, Aisha and Rohan came to understand that love is not a passive feeling, but a daily, conscious choice that requires attention, empathy, and courage. They learned that neglect is silent, slow, and insidious, and that emotional absence can wound more deeply than overt conflict, leaving scars that take time, effort, and honesty to heal. Aisha realized that seeking comfort elsewhere is rarely a betrayal, but rather a signal that needs have been unmet, and that emotional needs must be acknowledged and addressed within the relationship before they fester. Rohan discovered that good intentions are meaningless without active presence, that listening, remembering, and choosing each other consistently are vital acts of love, and that success in life means little if it comes at the cost of emotional connection. The couple committed to ongoing growth, recognizing that healing and intimacy are processes, not destinations, and that both hearts must remain vigilant, attentive, and compassionate to sustain what they had rebuilt. They reflected on Arjun's presence in Aisha's journey, not as a danger, but as a lesson about the importance of attention, understanding, and validation, and they were grateful that awareness had arrived before any irreversible damage occurred. Ultimately, Aisha and Rohan embraced the understanding that love thrives on time, presence, and choice, that vulnerability is strength, and that the quiet moments of acknowledgement can be more powerful than grand gestures. Their marriage, once silent and fading, now breathed with renewed energy, awareness, and commitment, standing as a testament to the lessons learned about attention, emotional presence, and the courage to confront the gaps that once threatened to destroy what they had built together. And in the end, they knew that the true measure of love is not in perfection, but in the effort to be seen, heard, and chosen, every day, in every small act, and in every conscious choice to remain present for each other.